Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today, I'm going to talk about the Death of Vertigo comics. And, as usual, I'm going to do it in a much different vein than everyone else is talking about right now. Because I want to pull back and look at the bigger picture. Because I think the Death of Vertigo comics symbolizes something much bigger. And that would be that it symbolizes the death of horror comics in your mainstream comic industry. Now, I'm sure some of you don't think of the Vertigo line as being horror comics, but I would argue that it was. Because if you remember or look at the comics that DC put out as horror comics in the 70s and the 60s, things like Swamp Thing or House of Mystery or House of Magic, these were comic titles that would fit very well within Vertigo Comics. And I think Vertigo was just a collection of all of those different smaller titles of horror comics that DC put out under one label. And if you look at the name of that label itself, Vertigo, I mean, if you've ever experienced vertigo, at best it is confusing. At worst, it is so frightening it can cause you paralysis. And so I would say that a comic line under the name of Vertigo, yeah, it has to do with horror comics. They may be specialized DC kinds of horror comics, but they were horror comics. And the thing is about horror comics, they were always there in the history of comic production, certainly for the last 50, 60 years at least. Because there are a number of different genres within comics. You have superhero comics, you have Western comics, you have war comics, you have romance comics, cartoony comics, and you have horror comics. Now, certainly I would say over the last 50, 60 years, your biggest genre was superhero comics. And a close second would be your cartoony comics. If you ever looked at the publication history of comics, sort of month by month, year by year, you would be amazed at how many of these cartoony titles came out. You know, Richie Rich and Archie and Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse, and still come out. But the third in line, I would say, is horror comics. And horror comics had a profound impact on the way comics were produced and the kinds of stories that were produced in comics. And when you look at all those different genres, when you label them as superhero or horror or romance or war, what you're doing is you're not defining what the characters are going to be like. What you are doing is you're defining what the characters have to deal with in the world that they are situated within. Now, you could be defining both at the same time, but the lion's share of that definition of the genre is what your characters have to deal with. So when you're talking about superhero comics, certainly your main characters are usually superheroes, but it's the fact that they have to deal with a world where there are superpowered individuals, and superpowered heroes, and superpowered villains. And when you look at war comics, you had characters that had to deal with the horrors of war. When you look at Western comics, again, you had characters who had to deal with the horrors and the reality of the Old West. And when you look at the genre of horror comics, you have characters that deal with a world or things within a world that are horrible. And horror comics, I would say, are a genre that work well and can be used for a lot of different things, whereas the other genres can't really pull themselves in that many directions. Because in horror comics, you can have a hero. You know, you have your Swamp Thing comics. You do have a hero. But I would say those older ones, certainly anyways, were horror comics. But you have the other comics, like House of Mystery. This was just a cautionary tale. You didn't have a hero. You didn't need a hero. So in your horror comics, you can have a hero, but you don't need one, certainly. So you can have all these different kinds of characters, all these different kinds of protagonists, because the whole point is that in this genre, you deal with a world, these characters have to deal with a world within which something horrible happens. And I think this is the main point of why these kinds of comics are so much in conflict with the current, quote-unquote, progressive regime that controls mainstream comics right now. And to examine that conflict, I want to look at that progressive regime for just a second. And I'm going to do it in a little bit of a funny way. I'm going to talk about someone who doesn't work for DC Comics, and when they were speaking, they weren't actually speaking about comics. It was Sana Amanat, and she was speaking simply to a room full of Democrats. Very, I would say, progressive Democrats, considering how much they cheered at some of the things that she said. But what she was doing was she was introducing President Obama. I do believe it was at the White House. And she gave a little bit of a speech of what she thought this progressive movement was all about at the first. And she said one line, which I think is a very overarching theme for the entire progressive movement, and certainly for the progressive movement within comics. She said this: people have to start realizing that different is the new normal. Now, I would say that there are several things wrong with that statement. Number one being that it simply is not true. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I covered in one of my videos the fact that your quote-unquote progressive people, they have a literal handbook of how to deal with others who don't agree with them. And one of their major tactics is to make those people feel isolated and alone, and so to cut them off and demoralize them. And one of the ways that they do this is to put out statements like this, to make everybody feel like, no, you see, you are the traditional, normal bunch of people. You are no longer in the majority. You're a minority. You don't have any friends. People don't think like you anymore. Different is the new normal. But they say this so much because it simply isn't true. This is why these kinds of people hate Middle America and flyover country, because I would say Middle America is just full of your normal, everyday people, your traditional, normal people, those people who are your normal good people, and those people who are your normal bad people, but just your traditional, normal people. Now, I can hear someone typing in the comments right now, how do you know what normal is? You can't just say everybody's normal. What's normal? Well, I would say, yes, you can define very clearly what normal is, because the confusion arises from the fact that these progressive people are always trying to teach you that normal is set up by other people around you, and by you, and by the institutions around you. So, by people. But I would say that's not the case at all. Normal is people acting according to a norm. And where does that norm come from? Who defines what that norm is? Well, that's the point. There is no who that defines what that norm is. Reality defines what that norm is. And again, these progressive people will always tell you that, oh, look, reality is defined by how you feel and what you think. But no, that's not the way reality works. Reality defines itself, and you got to live with it. And that living with it, that is the definition of the norm. All right, because reality is what it is. And people have to deal with reality in a way that works so they don't get chewed up and spit out by reality. And so that system within which they work is the norm. And so if you act according to that norm, you're normal. Now, you can have people who construct laws and rules around this norm, certainly, but it's reality that defines what that norm is. And so, yes, I would say the majority of people in every country are simply your traditional, normal people. And I'll get back to that line of thought in a few minutes. But I want to talk about the second problem with this little statement, that different is the new normal. Now, the second problem is that these progressive people who are putting out this statement and are using it as an overarching theme to their movement, in saying it, they are the biggest hypocrites around. Why? Because central and core to their movement is the fact that they see themselves as the defenders of the marginalized, of these small groups of people. They say that these small marginalized groups of people, they were persecuted in history, and that should never have happened. And so we owe them reparations and extra rights and all of these things to make up for those things where they were oppressed that never should have happened just because they were a minority. But the thing is that, let's assume for a second their statement is correct, that different is the new normal. If different is the new normal, as they claim, then who would be the minority? Well, the minority would be your traditional normal people. They would now be the minority if what they say is correct. And if they are the minority, and your progressive movement is your champion of the minority, shouldn't they be championing those people who hold those old traditional norms, that minority? They should be the champions of those people. They should be saying to everyone else around them, look, we need to help these people. We need to make sure that they don't get persecuted like other minorities did in the past. That's what they should be doing if they would actually do what they say and mean what they say. But that's not what they're doing at all. They are looking at traditional normal people, and they are making sure that they are subjugated in every way possible. They are making sure that they are marginalized in every way possible. And when something bad happens to your traditional normal people or traditional normal group of people, all they do is sit back and laugh and say, well, look, you deserve it. So, if their statement was actually true, it makes them the biggest hypocrites around. And the third problem with this little statement is the fact that these people, these quote-unquote progressive people who are putting forth the statement that different is the new normal, these are the people who, when you look at history, when they get into power, they are the people who erase as much diversity as possible, who erase as much difference as possible, who trample on individuals and every individual expression that they can get a hold of. So quite simply, they just don't believe it themselves. Because their movement really can be boiled down into a three-step process. What they're trying to do is, again, they're trying to isolate your traditional normal people, make them feel like they're alone and marginalized and demoralized, and they do that in order to erode the basis for your normal institutions, while at the same time these progressive leaders, what they do is they take marginalized people and they weaponize them. They weaponize them by putting them into groups and riling them up and making them angry and then pointing them at their enemy so that that marginalized group attacks the enemy of the progressive leaders. And at the same time that they do this, when these marginalized groups are taking themselves and making a group of themselves and consolidating their power, well, these leaders, they siphon off some of that power so that they have more and more power. And these three little stages are supposed to work out in the following way. Once they have eroded your traditional, normal institutions that are set up for people simply to deal well with reality, once they have eroded them enough, they'll use these groups of marginalized people to create such chaos that these progressive leaders can then implement their own system of what they claim to be normal. And when they do that, again, take a quick scan at history, when they do that, they take everything that is different, they take everything that is diverse, they take every kind of individual thought that doesn't agree with them, and they just squash it. But the point of talking about all that is the fact that there is a very simple way of describing that whole thing that I just talked about. What they're trying to do is they're trying to take the norm and flip it on its head. Quite simply, they're not trying to change it a little bit here and a little bit there. No, they're trying to flip it completely over. So they're trying to take those people who are just normal people, whether they're good or bad, but they're just normal people, and the institutions that are set up to help normal people deal with that norm, that is to say, deal with reality so they don't get chewed up and spit out by it. They're trying to take all of that, which normal people need in order to deal well with reality and flourish, and they're trying to make sure it goes on the bottom and that they go on the top. They, with their ideas that reality isn't actually real, it is defined by what you think and what you feel, and that is the new normal. So, as I say, they're trying to take everything and flip it on its head. And this is what is happening with comics. And you can see it very clearly sometimes when you read the comics about these quote-unquote progressive heroes that they're putting out there. Because a lot of us are looking at these progressive heroes and saying to ourselves, hey, wait a second, they're not heroes at all. They're villains. These characters that are portrayed as heroes, they're actually villains. And when you read the stories like that, you say to yourself, well, you know what? I'm actually rooting for who they claim to be the villain in this story, in this comic. Because those quote-unquote villains are acting in a more heroic way than the people they claim to be heroes. So you can see, they're taking the entire thing and flipping it on its head. But it's a little difficult to see when you're dealing with superheroes and when you're dealing with heroes in general. Sometimes, certainly, it becomes hard to see. But when you're dealing with something like horror comics, it becomes spectacularly easy to see. Because When you're dealing with heroes, well, heroes have to do with human flourishing. It is a state of flourishing. You want to become a hero. It's something that you build up to. So it is a bit complicated. But when you're dealing with horror, you're dealing with something that's very primitive, something that's very basic, something that deals with simple survival. And when you break it down to something that's that simple, you get to see this flipping of everything on its head very easily. Now, the people, these progressive people who put out the comics in this way, they can't see this because they think in their ideology that everything is taught to you by the institutions around you. You are born as a blank slate and everything is taught to you. Your fears and what you think of as horrible, that's simply something that was taught to you. And so you can be untaught what has been taught to you. So basically, they think that what your fears are and what you are horrified by is a piece of software in your brain. But the thing is that we know from science that it is not software. It is hardware. It is hardwired into your brain to be afraid of certain things and to be horrified by certain things. And it is a part of your survival mechanism. Whenever you encounter something different, your brain, somewhere back in the older part of it, just raises a red flag and says, oh, hold on a second. Just wait. That's something different. It might be something dangerous. If you want to survive, be careful. And when you are exposed to something that is horrible, that older part of your brain, it raises a massive red flag and says, stop, back away now. That's simply what your brain does. Because again, your brain is hardwired to do these things. And I would say that is part of the draw of horror comics and horror in general. It's because of the fact that most of us don't have to deal with life and death survival situations anymore. And we want to be able to experience these things that we don't have to deal with anymore. These survival instincts, these horrible things that we get exposed to, where our brain puts up this massive red flag and says, back away now. That would be, in my experience, what horror comics and the horror genre altogether is about. But the point is that that older part of your brain, it knows what is different and what is dangerous and what is horrible. And it has these categorized in the back of your head in that older part of your brain. And so it can pick out things that are horrible very clearly, very quickly. But again, to move back to what these progressive people are trying to do with comics, they're trying to take everything and flip it on its head. And so what they're trying to do is take things which are considered traditional normal and make them the horrible. And they're trying to take the things that are horrible and make them the norm. That's what they're trying to do. And if you look at some of these Vertigo comics that have come out over the last year, you can see this plain as day. You look at titles like Border Town, where in that comic, what was the horrible? Well, the horrible was your traditional people, your plain old normal Americans. They were considered the horrible in that comic. And if you look at the characters who were supposed to be, I suppose, heroes in the eyes of the people who were writing it, these people, these characters, they did horrible things. They were racist. They were racist to the core. And if you look at something like Hex Wives, you can see this even more. Because what was portrayed as the horrible in that book? Well, just plain old suburbia. Plain old suburbia was the horrible in this book. And what was supposed to be the norm was these witches who killed people, these witches who tortured people, and not just killed and tortured and maimed people, but did so in massively horrible ways. But they were considered the norm. They were considered the characters that you were supposed to identify with. They were considered the ones who were fighting against the horrible of suburbia. But again, everybody has that older part of their brain that works spectacularly well to tell you what to be afraid of and to tell you what is actually horrible. And when you're looking at these books, you can see very well that what they are portraying as the heroic part of this book, as the normal part of this book, that's something horrific. These characters and their actions that you're supposed to be identifying with, these are horrific characters. If they were real people, they would be horrible people. In the case of Hex Wives, they would be horrible people to the extent that they would be serial killers horrible. And this is the exact reason why you have now seen the death of Vertigo comics. And you have now witnessed the death of horror comics within your mainstream comic industry. Because these quote-unquote progressive people have taken everything and flipped it on its head. But you and I, and every person who hasn't been indoctrinated into their ideology, us normal people, we still realize that in the back of our brains, we know exactly what is horrible. And we have simply completely walked away from comics which try to portray the normal as horrible and the horrible as normal. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.